you already know, I like to talk about issues in a spontaneous way. I like to talk about politically loaded, heavy, deep, complex issues in a spontaneous way, which is not normally what you get on the internet. It's not normally what you get in peer-reviewed academic papers or presented at conferences. So this is a video I planned to make months ago. We've been so busy, especially just dealing with life, career, education, travel type of things. And now I'm going to sneeze. Symbolically appropriate sneeze, indicating how busy we are. I said, okay, I'm not going to make any more videos about Aristotle until we fly back from France. But just now I thought, you know what, why don't I sit down and do a super spontaneous video on Aristotle? And from my perspective, it's going to be more enjoyable and interesting because I haven't been thinking about this role. I've been not thinking about it for long enough that I'm not really burdened with all of the reading and research I did before, because I did do a lot of reading, not just inside the primary source text here, but of various academic articles. So I'm going to kick this off by stating what the puzzle is that Aristotle has left us about his most fundamental and obvious belief about democracy and dictatorship. You could also express this as polity and monarchy. But however you want to put it, whether a city-state like Athens should be ruled by the masses or should be ruled by just one man, what really is his position on this? Now, hey, it's a big book, right? Aristotle's Politics, it's big, and it's been translated many times and studied by many scholars. How could this possibly be ambiguous? Well, my own conclusion is that this has everything to do with the fact that the conclusion of the book is missing, and part of the dramatization of his argument, part of his attempt to make his argument interesting and enticing, is that he was intentionally being a bit ambivalent and ambiguous in several stages leading up to his shocking conclusion. So I'll say more about that at the conclusion of my own video here. And for me, there's a really interesting and really provocative, but ultimately non-explanatory observation in pointing out the extent to which Aristotle was, a secret agent of Macedonia. So in this political period, Athens is one country and Macedonia is another. And there is a very overt military as well as political struggle for which is to be the dominant power, not just over Greece, but over a large part of the known world from the perspective of Greece. And generally speaking, during Aristotle's lifetime, the power of Macedonia was increasing, but not steadily so, not predictably so. If you were living through that period of time, at many points, it would not have been obvious that Alexander the Great would become the only name remembered by history from that whole century, which he almost is. Aristotle's name also is remembered. And if you don't know, there is indeed an historical connection between Aristotle and Alexander the Great, a connection that is as well proven as anything from this period of history can be. So what's the mystery? I mean, this is not George R.R. Martin. This is supposedly not written in riddles, right? This is a thesis and a morality lecture that's telling us what we ought to think and what we ought to believe. So it ought to be clear. It ought to be clear as day and not clear as mud. But what it is clear as mud. Okay, so I'm reading from about section 1287b. So when I'm saying section 1287, this is ultimately the manuscript pagination. You can use this to find the correct page in any given translation or edition in any language, English, Greek, French, whatever other translation you have to have. So using that universal number system, we're starting around 1287 to 1288 here. Okay, when it happens that the whole of a family or even a single person is of merit so outstanding as to surpass the merit of all the rest, it is only just that this family should be vested with kingship and absolute sovereignty, or that this single person should become a king and absolute sovereign. Okay? Pause. So if we just read you that sentence, anyone would be within the rights to say, oh, well, Aristotle clearly supports dictatorship, whether it's monarchy or some other kind of situation like having one king rule. That's completely clear. But probably all of you watching this video know, in some broad sense, Aristotle is remembered as a philosopher of democracy and to some extent by and for democracy. So I'm now just going to skip a couple of sentences, really. So still on the same page, we're around 1288 in the original pagination, but skipping just a couple of sentences down the same page. He then says, quote, "It would be no less improper to require him to take his turn at being a subject under a system of rotation. A whole is never intended by nature to be inferior to a part, and a man so greatly superior to others stands to them in the relation of a whole to its parts." Okay? So this is the bizarre claim, not that democracy is the whole, and say the president, the one leader of the democracy, is the part. It's saying that the individual man, the monarch or dictator, who's so superior to everyone else, that he is the whole, and that the rest of his whole society are merely his parts. So this sounds like an extreme, surreal. I mean, it seems like he's joking, especially if you read the whole text or a larger part of the whole text. Okay, so now I'm switching to a completely different part of the text. So many pages later, elsewhere in the text, and this is not the only contrast you should make, but this is one extreme contrast. Okay, so quote. And this is now 1332, thereabouts, 1332 to 1335 in the original pagination. Okay. We may imagine one set of circumstances in which it would be obviously better that a lasting distinction should once and for all be established between governors and those who are governed. This would be if there were one class in the state, one class of people, surpassing all others, as much as gods and heroes are supposed to surpass mankind. Sorry to misspeak there. A class of men so outstanding, physically as well as mentally, that the superiority of the ruling stock was indisputably clear to their subjects. But that is a difficult assumption to make, and we have nothing in actual life like the gulf between kings and subjects, which the writer Silax describes as existing in India. We may therefore draw the conclusion, which can be defended on many grounds, that all should share alike in a system of government under which they rule and are ruled by turns. In a society of peers, equality means that all should have the same rights, and a constitution can hardly survive if it is founded on injustice. And the editor here adds that the clear meaning is that you cannot have a constitution that gives different rights to men who are fundamentally of the same quality, who are fundamentally equal, which is the situation in reality. So we here have a somewhat bizarre clarification. The first passage I read states that in theory, it would be perfectly acceptable or even preferable to have a society where men are ruled over a superior family who is so superior over the subjects that it's like the comparison between gods and normal men. And of course, this is ancient Greece, so you know what type of gods they're talking about. And he specifies physically as well as mentally, the statues and so on. And you might wonder, well, this is a period of time when he basically serves Alexander the Great. Does he have in mind that Alexander the Great is one of these godlike kings? And then we have a separate passage we contrast this to where this is laughed at and scorned as being completely ridiculous. Apparently some other author named Skylax says that that's the case in India, that in India the rulers are totally superior to the people being ruled by, I don't know, some Greek who managed to travel all the way to India and back and survive to tell the tale. Well, yeah, maybe they say that about India, but let me tell you, in reality, he says, in actuality, there is no such condition in the real world. In reality, all of us in Athens are equal, so therefore we must have democracy. And his idea of democracy, one of the fundamental concepts for him, maybe not for our side today, is just a replacement and rotation. That today you're the judge in court. Next year, you're a member of the jury. The year after that, you're the person being judged. In the same way, it really is the jury more than the presidency, I think, that he has in mind. The idea of everyone participating by turns, one at a time. I'm now going to read really quickly some brief comments from this article. This is a traditional, conventional, academic, peer-reviewed article titled On Aristotle's Critique of Athenian Democracy. And I'm going to tell you why I think this is a significant, but ultimately kind of irrelevant and distracting observation of this other big question. And maybe you'd imagine this explains why. Why does Aristotle take this strong but paradoxical position on democracy versus monarchy, however we're going to put it? Okay, quote, "The third reason stems," you can tell we're starting in midstream here. We're not starting on page 1. We're already on the third reason. You don't get to hear the first 2 reasons. Go read the whole article if you want to read it all. "The third reason stems from Aristotle's 25-year opposition to Athenian policy towards Macedon and the consequent precariousness of his position in Athens. It is not surprising that he held Athens' leaders in low regard. It is not surprising that he considered Athens an extreme democracy, governed by low birth, low income, and vulgarity." The choice of words here differs a bit from translation to translation, but what he is hinting at when he says, in some editions it is bracketed by some editors. Many of the people who translated this into English and modern languages are so shocked by how harsh the wording is here that they put in brackets just to suggest that this must have been added by some other author or this must be a corruption of the text. They're just in disbelief. They cannot believe that Aristotle's words against democracy are this harsh and are this extreme. That's just an editorial. It's a human reaction. It's an emotional reaction. There's no scientific evidence for this. There's no basis for this. They're just shocked. So again, the wording is even harsher than it sounds here. It's governed by vulgar idiots. This is what he's saying about Athens. Well, believe it. I mean, again, even the 2 passages I just read to you now, I think it is fair to say that Aristotle has mixed feelings and mixed emotions. And remember, Athens was not paradise for intellectuals. Athens killed Socrates, and everyone was still in its shadow, most of all people like Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was basically never allowed to go downtown. He was a second-class citizen. He was a medic. So his school was located outside of the symbolic city walls, but there were a lot of institutions in Athens, I believe, he was never allowed to set foot in. Maybe he was given a tour at some point, but he was a second-class citizen in Athens himself. And as we're going to read here, there was this question to what extent he supported Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedon, at a time when really Athens was fighting for its survival against Alexander of Macedon. It is not surprising that he would have preferred to empower an elite of educated gentlemen who would have neither squandered Athens' resources on a war with Macedon nor persecuted philosophy. Moreover, he was not alone in this position. In the 350s and 340s, Isocrates, this is not Socrates if you're reading on screen, Isocrates if you prefer, with an I at the front, had advocated a more elitist government for Athens under the title of an Areopagite or ancestral constitution. Like Aristotle, he also courted the Macedonian king Philip, and so, for that matter, did the head of the academy, Speusippus. Very approximate translation from someone who never studied ancient Greek. Many, if not most, of Athens' leading intellectuals had broken with democracy and were in favor of Macedonian hegemony. Well, many, if not most, is quite a claim. You see there was a footnote there. This is based on which texts have survived history. Aristotle was employed for 6 years as tutor to King Philip's son, Alexander. A decade later, Alexander took 2 of Aristotle's nephews, Callisthenes and Nicanor, on his expedition against Persia. They had served respectively as an official historian and a general. Meanwhile, Aristotle had become a close friend of the man whom Alexander left behind to govern Macedonia and to keep watch on Greece, the formidable Antipater, who would be the executor of Aristotle's last will and testament. That is a document that survives history, so we know what it says in Aristotle's last will and testament, and that it names this historical figure and establishes thus the tight political cooperation, personal and political relationship between the two men. Aristotle left behind correspondence with Philip, Alexander, and Antipater. So if you don't know, Philip of Macedon was the king of Macedonia and was the father of Alexander the Great, and then Alexander the Great took over. Philip was, in fact, assassinated, although little of it survives today. Aristotle also had close ties to the tyrant of Aternius in the Troad, one Hermias, whose kingdom he lived in for 3 years following his departure from Athens in 348. Blah, blah, blah. Let's skip a little bit here. Aristotle first came to Athens to study in 367 and did not leave until 348. He did not return until 335 and stayed until his exile in 323. It has usually been thought that Aristotle left Athens in 348 following the death of Plato and Aristotle's failure to be chosen as his successor at the head of the academy. It has been plausibly argued, however, that Aristotle was constrained to leave before Plato's death, redated to early 347, because of the anti-Macedonian sentiment following Philip's destruction of Olynthus. We do have historical records on this event. It was indeed a kind of bloody and shocking massacre sort of situation. Stirred up a lot of anti-Macedonian empire sentiment. People seem to have less trouble approving of an empire when it's massacring other people far away and have difficulty reconciling themselves to it when it's massacring your own people right at home. And Alexander the Great's empire did both. And it's also very plausible that in an earlier period of his life, Aristotle might have been making excuses for Alexander. In a later period of life, maybe he started to see the wisdom of having the democratic system or something like it, something vaguely democratic in some sense, that he saw working in Athens. It is certainly striking that Aristotle did not return to Athens until 335, when Alexander had just put down an anti-Macedonian rebellion in the Greek city-states, and that he left Athens again precisely in 323, when the news of the death of Alexander the Great occasioned a second anti-Macedonian revolt, also known as the Lamian War. So the picture that emerges, therefore, is of a wealthy man who came from a city nearly 1,000 miles away from Athens. He had inherited a connection to the Macedonian royal court, which he energetically pursued, thus placing himself in opposition to the political tendency that dominated Athens for most of his adult life. So we have here a vision of Aristotle torn between two very powerful political tendencies. And this produced, I don't know, should I use the term cognitive dissonance? It produced some mixed feelings in his political writings. When you have these contradictory extreme impulses in the politics of Aristotle, I don't think one is sincere and one is insincere. I think he means both. I think he kind of yearns for contradictory and unattainable things. And the other big story that's going on here, could be a separate video, I guess, in many ways what he's trying to do is jilt Plato off of his throne. Plato's writing on politics is garbage. I have actually read Plato's Laws. Most people haven't. A very long and boring book. This does directly criticize and pillory Plato's Laws. It criticizes many contemporary authors, some of whom their work is no longer extant except for his criticism of them. But like Plato, the one thing he has in common with Plato is the hope that in future the government will take over the role of defining, controlling, and guiding public education. And that's the conclusion the whole book is building towards, and it's the conclusion that's missing. The way forward, the fundamental solution to the riddle of both Athenian politics and the larger scale Greek politics that were at that time dominated by Macedonia, in his opinion, is improving the system of education, in a sense, creating a system of education in a country that had no system of education. People just used private tutors. There were no government schools. There was nothing like that. There was government military service, but it was military service only. All of his hope for the future of Athenian democracy or dictatorship, or both, is placed in a dream of public education. And in that sense, I think he felt he was completing the mission that started with Socrates, carried on in a much transformed vehicle in the philosophy of Plato, and he was bringing it to its true and final conclusion. That is exactly the conclusion of the book we're lacking today. And that's what allows him to have these contradictory statements. One of the most famous things, one of the first things I was told about Aristotle was that his view was that democracy was one of the worst forms of government. And you can find isolated passages saying that. But you can also find long, substantive, positive passages, both here in the Politics and in a separate work that's called the Constitution of Athens. I think I got that right here. Here titled The Athenian Constitution. Long, passionate, seemingly sincere passages talking about all the advantages of democracy, how it works so much better than monarchy or dictatorship or tyranny or what have you, and giving all kinds of practical advice for how to improve democracy on a case-by-case basis. I guess you can say ultimately it lets him wiggle out of recommending any one form of government. It lets him wiggle out of committing to support Alexander the Great at a time when everyone, including his own blood relatives, his own father, his own political connections, his direct relationship with the man who was appointed dictator of that part of Greece, who was the executor of his will and his personal friend, everyone was expecting him to univocally and enthusiastically endorse Alexander the Great as king. And he shows a fair bit of moral courage in refusing to do that. But he doesn't really show enough moral courage to go all the way in opposing the rule of Alexander the Great. Instead, what we get is him vesting all of his hopes in education. Okay, guys, that's 20 minutes. I know this video is not going to be popular with my audience. I know I'd get more viewers and more appreciation if I just talk about the themes you guys are already expecting me to hear. But ultimately, I have a commitment to provide a higher level of substance, even if I'm the only one who watches this video. When I come back to look at what my life was, maybe 20 years from now, what it was I learned at age 40, when I remained, like Aristotle, a perpetual student learning new things right up until my death.
Dun, 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 dun.